Hello and welcome to Preemie Chats, a space where we connect, learn, and share stories about the world of prematurity. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, a proud Preemie parent and executive director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, or CPBF, and I'm so honored to have you join us here today. As we begin, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, acknowledge that Canada is home of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have stewarded this land for millennia. We honor their enduring connection to this land and express our gratitude for the opportunities to live, learn, and work here. As an immigrant to this country, I am on a continuous journey to learn about the true history of this land, to understand the experience of Indigenous peoples, and to reflect on my role in reconciliation. I'm very grateful to share this space with all of you here today. Preemie Chats is brought to you by CPBF, a parent-led charitable organization dedicated to supporting families, advocate for the needs of premature babies, and providing the latest information and resources to help parents and caregivers navigate this journey. Whether you're a parent, healthcare professional, researcher, or someone interested in understanding more about preterm birth, you are in the right place. Together, we are building a supportive community where stories are shared, questions are answered, new evidence is explored, and no one feels alone. Be sure to visit our website, canadianpreemies.org, where you'll find helpful resources, our latest projects, and most importantly, a community of people who wants to see our little babies thrive. If you're watching live, please join the conversation. Share your questions and comments in the chat. We will address them during our program. And if you're watching a recorded session, you can still connect with us through our website. It is through meaningful conversations like this one that we advance practice and learn together. So let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And today's episode, we'll be discussing the barriers to health for First Nations families. First Nations children face unique, complex barriers to health rooted in historical, socio-political, and economic factors, many of which stem from colonization. The health disparities between First Nations children and their non-Indigenous peers reflect the cumulative impact of systemic discrimination, poverty, limited access to services, and erosion of cultural practices. This chat will examine how addressing these barriers requires understanding both the immediate and long-term challenges and committing to systemic change that respects First Nations rights and culture. And we have here joining us live from Sul-Lookout, Northern Ontario, Candi Edwards, who is an experienced professional with extensive expertise in Indigenous advocacy, particularly in the areas of perinatal care, early childhood learning, youth development, and healthy living. Throughout her career, she has been actively involved in community advancement, capacity building, planning, and service projects at the regional, provincial, and national levels. Her work is dedicated to promoting the well-being and growth of First Nations communities. Candi is now the Director of Approach to Community Wellbeing Public Health at Sul-Lookout First Nations Health Authority. She's a proud member of the Anambigu Zagagagan Anishinaabe, a mother of three, a sister to many, a wife, a daughter, and a granddaughter, and a wonderful person who had the honor to spend a week with just last month. Candi, thank you so much for joining us here today to teach us so we can listen and learn and do better.
Well, thank you, Fabiana, for inviting me. I am really honored to be able to be here with you today and share just a little bit of the experiences that I've had and the work that I've been doing for the last couple of decades.
Wonderful. So we do have a presentation to share with us. And to all of you watching us live, please do send us your questions, your comments, your insights, everything that you want to learn. And there will be having a discussion after Candi's presentation. Candi, the floor is yours.
Miigwech, Fabiana. Okay, so we are gathered here today to talk about some of the barriers that First Nations families face in being healthy and being well. And some of them, as Fabiana said, are unique and they're very complex. It's multi-layered. So to situate us, oops, wrong button, there we go. This is a map of Northern Ontario that you can see, and you can see it's a very large geographical proportion of Ontario, but the population isn't very large. Most of the communities that are depicted on this blown up area of the map are remote, primarily fly-in First Nations communities with limited access to services that include education, employment, and health, services that many of us really take for granted on a day-to-day basis. So access to health and well-being. The barriers that impede access for First Nations children are varied. They do include financial barriers, historical barriers, systemic discrimination and racism. There are limited services that are available in communities, including healthcare. So to set a little bit of the stage, we're going to talk first about the historical context and the legacy of colonization. So colonization isn't something that just happened long ago. There are impacts of colonization that are perpetuated upon Indigenous people to this day. So historical treatment of First Nations peoples has significantly shaped the current health inequities experienced by their children. Colonization, residential schools, the 60s scoop, which is a term that was used for First Nations children being removed from their families and given to non-Indigenous families to raise, feeling that First Nations families weren't capable of raising their children well, and displacing a great number of children during that time that are still trying to reconnect to their roots. Racism, discrimination, forced relocation, and imposition of Western norms and practices on Indigenous communities have led to a loss of traditional knowledge, cultural identity, and language. The legacy of these policies continues to manifest in many areas of life, but particularly in health. First Nations children today are not only affected by direct historical trauma, but also by the intergenerational impacts that have been passed down through families and communities. These adverse historical events have resulted in high rates of mental health challenges, substance use disorders, and other social and emotional difficulties among First Nations children. And this includes the continuation of children being overrepresented in the child welfare system, despite being a smaller proportion of the population. So to dive in a little bit deeper, socioeconomic barriers. So these are actual pictures from community stores. So you can see that the orange juice, not extravagant, not something that many of us wouldn't buy for our own families, is $26.29 for a jug of orange juice. Tomatoes were $20.79 a pound. This is unsustainable, unaffordable, and it limits the ability of First Nations families to feed their children well, which limits their ability to be well. So one of the most significant barriers to health for First Nations children is the socioeconomic disparity that they face. Many First Nations communities are located in rural and remote areas, which often lack adequate infrastructure, economic opportunities, and access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and housing. Poverty is pervasive, with disproportionately high percentages of First Nations children living in low-income households. This economic disadvantage contributes to poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, overcrowded housing, and limited access to clean water. These factors can lead to a range of physical and mental health problems, including respiratory issues, infectious diseases, and developmental delays. Furthermore, the lack of economic opportunities for parents exacerbates stress within families, which can negatively affect the overall well-being of children. So this infographic came from a food affordability report that we did a couple of years ago now, and hopefully you can see it, but what it says essentially is that for the families that are served in the Kuwaitanang area, which is the Sulika First Nations area region of Ontario, the average cost per month of food to feed a family of 4, based on the nutritious food basket, was $1,769. which is significantly higher than other places in the province. But especially problematic is that was for less than 50% of the food on the list. So usually people go out and do food costing studies, and they have a standard list of foods that they're costing for and calculate the average cost per month to feed a family of 4 based on these lists. More than 50% of the items on the list were not even available in First Nations communities. And these were considered sort of standard food items to feed your family well for a month. You can substitute things if there's a substitute, but less than 50% there was a substitute for. Other socioeconomic barriers that I spoke about. So housing is a very high concern issue in First Nations communities. There is limited housing, and the housing is typically very poorly made. It's not well ventilated. It leads to mold overgrowth and things like that. There are not enough homes for the number of families and communities, and it's not unheard of to have, 11 people in a 2-bedroom home or 17 people in a 3-bedroom home. This was particularly noticeable for us when we were working on COVID-19 recommendations and isolation, that people were not able to isolate. There's 1 bathroom in their home serving 12 people. So the rise in infectious diseases, poor mental health, poor sleep hygiene, health issues related to mold and things like that, lack of privacy, all of those can impact the ability to be healthy and to be well. This is also further challenged in the remote area that we work in which even just accessing building materials is very, very difficult. There are no roads to communities, so things have to be shipped in on airplanes or driven over winter roads. The winter road system has been limited in the last couple of years, largely due to climate change. So the winter road season is shorter, which means less material can get shipped into the communities to build new houses or to improve the houses that exist. Another barrier is just the access to health services and access to equal services. So this picture might be familiar to some of you. This is Jordan River Anderson, and he was a little fellow that suffered as a result of a lack of willingness to take responsibility for his care. There were fights between the province and the federal governments over who was going to pay for his care, essentially. And he had some complex medical needs, and he spent the entire 5 years of his life in the hospital because there was no acceptance of responsibility to fund care for him to be closer to home. So access to healthcare is a critical determinant of health outcomes for all children, yet First Nations children often face significant barriers in this regard. Many remote Indigenous communities experience a shortage of healthcare professionals and infrastructure, and those that do exist are often underfunded and overstretched. Additionally, the quality of healthcare services provided to First Nations children is often substandard when compared to those in non-Indigenous communities. Historical mistrust of healthcare systems due to past discriminatory practices and mistreatment of Indigenous people in medical settings further deters families from seeking necessary care for their children. Furthermore, many First Nations children face linguistic and cultural barriers when interacting with healthcare providers, as most health professionals are not familiar with Indigenous cultural practices or languages. So some of the other lack of service available to residents of First Nations communities in remote areas, regular access to dental care. We've had, I believe we had 2 in a population of under 30,000 people, 2 deaths related to oral abscesses that led to sepsis during the pandemic period. So there wasn't regular ongoing care, but there wasn't even emergency care available. There are very high infection rates, skin infections, lung infections. This mistrust has also impacted vaccination rates in terms of, hesitancy or really just the trust in the system to do what's best for them. often what we heard during COVID-19 when we spoke about vaccination, because First Nations people, Indigenous people in Canada were a priority population, they felt that they were being experimented on again. And this goes back to that colonization where there were experiments done on children to determine, the impacts of starvation on a child while they were attending residential school and so on. And then also access to healthy foods that I spoke about already. So this is Shannon Kustasian. She was a young person that was very passionate about the access to education and the access to equitable education. She had visited, I believe, a school off reserve somewhere and went back and, why don't we have a library? Why don't we have books like that? Why don't we have a gym and equipment to practice physical activity and so on? And so she became an activist for education. She was sadly killed in a car accident and at a very young age. I believe she was 16 when she died, but it did raise some awareness about the barriers that were related to education that First Nations families face. And, there is a very strong association between education and health and wellness. So education is another critical area where First Nations children face systemic barriers. While access to education has improved in recent years, many First Nations communities still struggle with underfunded schools, overcrowded classrooms, and a lack of culturally relevant curriculum. The absence of culturally appropriate education leads to disengagement and poor academic performance, which can limit future opportunities for these children. Furthermore, First Nations children are more likely to experience barriers related to mental health, such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress, which can interfere with their ability to learn and thrive in educational settings. These challenges are compounded by the trauma experienced by many children as a result of the historical mistreatment of their communities, which can manifest as behavioral issues in school and difficulty forming healthy relationships with peers and teachers. Another thing that some people may be unfamiliar with is that children that attend schools in remote First Nations communities can often only stay at home to attend school until grade 8. Some communities grade 9, one community, I believe, grade 10, and I think one of the communities now goes up to grade 12. So parents start preparing to send their 13-year-old, 14-year-old child off to live among strangers, either in boarding homes or in schools that also board students. This, practice of sending children away from their support systems and their communities and everything they've ever known during a particularly vulnerable time in their lives often leads to other issues that impact health and wellness. So substance use, depression, anxiety, loneliness, but they're also often at risk of sort of predatory behaviors like human trafficking, gang affiliation, and so on. Another barrier is the cultural and psychological impact of dislocation. So forced dislocation of First Nations people, including the loss of traditional lands, has had a profound psychological effect on both children and adults in communities. Many Indigenous children are raised in environments where they experience a disconnection from culture, language, and traditional practices. This cultural dislocation can create a sense of identity confusion and insecurity, making it difficult for children to form positive self-concepts. Cultural practices such as traditional healing, family bonding, and community support systems have been eroded in many communities. And this contributed to a loss of protective factors that are known to enhance children's resilience. As a result, First Nations children may struggle with low self-esteem, feelings of isolation, and difficulties in building strong, healthy relationships. Environmental barriers. Environmental factors. This is actually a very hot topic right now in Ontario and in Canada around some of the legislation that is being pushed through and the lack of attention to really meaningful consultation with First Nations communities. So environmental factors contribute significantly to health challenges faced by First Nations children. Many Indigenous communities are located in areas where environmental degradation, such as pollution, resource extraction, and climate change, pose a direct threat to the health and well-being of children. For example, many communities rely on untreated water sources, leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Additionally, the loss of traditional food sources due to environmental destruction has impacted the nutritional status of First Nations children. Moreover, the changing climate has made the communities more vulnerable to extreme weather events, further exacerbating health risks and putting additional pressure on already limited healthcare resources. This is a topic that comes up over and over again, in conversations with health directors or in communities, that animal patterns have changed, that the snow is different than it used to be, and this lack of attention to the impacts of climate change on people who are it's an interdependence with the land, it's really atrocious, to be honest. And then the resource extraction that continues with very little meaningful consultation with First Nations communities continues to this day. Mental health and trauma is a growing concern for First Nations children, many of whom experience high levels of trauma related to that intergenerational trauma, violence, substance use, and neglect. Studies have shown that First Nations children are at increased risk of developing mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. These mental health issues, though, are often compounded by stigma and discrimination that they face in accessing healthcare and education. The lack of culturally appropriate mental health services and under-resourced mental health infrastructure in many First Nations communities exacerbate these challenges. As a result, many children do not receive the support they need to cope with trauma and mental health issues, which can have long-lasting effects on their development and well-being. This goes beyond mental health and mental illness to, developmental delays and access to services, supportive services and interventions. I worked with a family a number of years ago who had a single father had a child with profound autism, nonverbal, and was told he would have to move away from his community to be able to access appropriate services for that child. So now you're asking a single father to move away from the only support system he has to be able to access services for his young boy. Another set of barriers are around legal and policy. Legal and policy frameworks that govern the health and well-being of First Nations children often fail to adequately address their specific needs. Despite efforts to improve conditions, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and various Canadian policies aimed at addressing the needs of Indigenous populations, the implementation of these policies has been inconsistent and insufficient. Jurisdictional issues, such as the division of responsibilities between federal and provincial governments, further complicate access to services and resources for First Nations communities. In many cases, First Nations children are caught between bureaucratic systems that fail to prioritize their needs, leading to delays in accessing services and inadequate supports. So going back to Jordan River Anderson, from that, you might have heard of Jordan's Principle, which was a program intended to meet needs of First Nations children and ensure that they had access to the same level of services and supports and opportunities as children that were not in First Nations communities or of First Nations descent. And it has not lived up to the intention of it. There are often significant waiting lists, things like wheelchairs might be denied, and it isn't the solution to everything. So there are gaps in what children have access to that are really related to policy barriers. So what do we do? How do we remove those barriers? How do we bridge some gaps? So when we're making efforts to address health barriers faced by First Nations children, we have to take a holistic approach that recognizes the interconnection between health, culture, community, and policy. Solutions must include the restoration and revitalization of traditional knowledges and practices, as well as the integration of cultural competence into healthcare and educational systems. Furthermore, there's a need for greater investment in healthcare infrastructure, particularly in remote communities, to ensure that First Nations children have access to quality care. Policies must also be reformed to prioritize the health, education, and well-being of First Nations children, and Indigenous peoples must be involved in the development and implementation of these policies. Indigenous-led organizations and community-based initiatives have shown that locally tailored, culturally relevant programs can significantly improve the health outcomes of First Nations children. For example, programs that incorporate traditional healing methods, family support, and community engagement have demonstrated positive impacts on children's physical and mental health. By empowering First Nations communities to take ownership of their health and well-being, these programs are laying the groundwork for a healthier future for Indigenous children. Barriers to health faced by First Nations children are multifaceted and deeply entrenched in historical, cultural, and socioeconomic factors. These barriers are the result of ongoing systemic inequities that have persisted for generations. To achieve meaningful improvements in the health and well-being of First Nations children, there must be a concerted effort to address the root causes of these disparities, with a focus on cultural preservation, community empowerment, and systemic change. Only by recognizing the unique needs of First Nations children and ensuring they have access to the resources and support they need can we hope to break the cycle of disadvantage and build a healthier, more equitable future for all Indigenous children. Strong today, stronger tomorrow. And thank you, and miigwech. And I'm happy to answer questions or just hear from people maybe about some of the work that they're doing in their areas. Miigwech.
Wow, Candi, thank you so much for shining a light for us to see the real problems, to understand the historical events that led to where we are today. Because for a lot of people like me as an immigrant to Canada, I don't have that information. I never learned anything about it. So I am my learning process. And I'm so grateful for you to come and present and teach us and to really allow me to go to your community and understand all the everything that you talk about today at the community, to really feel what it is. And I want to start by, I wanted people to understand what you were talking about, because when you talk about communities that don't have road access, and when I arrived in Sulucal, so this is the end of the road, right? And what does that mean for people? If we're in the big cities, we have no idea what that means. So teach us what that means and how people can come and then we can talk about the pregnant people, because this is, for me, it really touched my heart, right? Because we run a parent organization. We are all parents. We have high-risk pregnancies. And I saw what can happen to those families in your community. So just give us a little bit of that geographic location.
Sure, yes. So for the context, the Suluka First Nations Health Authority serves 33 First Nations communities. Approximately 7 of them have year-round road access. So 2 of the communities that you visited while you were up in our region have road access. Now, what does that actually mean? It is a road, but there is no cell phone service. There is no, it's very isolated. We saw, 10 bears probably on our trip. It's not, a well-traveled road. There are frequent road closures. So even the communities that have road access, it's not necessarily the safest or most accessible route to get anywhere. So many of the communities, 27 of them, do not have all-season roads at all. And so they build ice roads in the winter time to try and get supplies in and out of their communities, to make life slightly more affordable, but also to, as I said, all of the building materials, all of the fuel for homes to heat them through the winter, that all has to be trucked in on ice roads because it can't be flown in. So the fly-in communities too, they're very tiny little airports. There are frequent, poor visibility. So I've done a number of flybys where I've flown for 3 hours just to end up back in Sulikout because they weren't able to land at the airport. They're very little airports. We have a number of airports right now that are under threat of fire, wildfire, and a number of communities that have been evacuated. So one of the communities, the airport they have no other way out of the community, and they had to fly 37 people at a time out to a larger center to get them on a larger plane so that they could be evacuated to the Toronto area. So when you have a population and this was a larger community, but of that population, almost 1,000 people were considered medically vulnerable. So they might have been people that were pregnant, young children, elders, people with cardiac or respiratory illness, and they were the first priority. So to take 1,000 people out of a community, 35 to 37 people out of a time, with limited visibility for flights and so on, it was a very, very tenuous and stressful situation. So when I'm talking about isolated, they're very isolated communities.
Absolutely. And for the context of our organization, because we work with pregnant parents and some high-risk pregnancies, so I was blown away to learn what happened to those parents, those moms and pregnant people who leave the community, to use the words they evacuate from their community, they go to Sulikout and they stay in a hostel on confinement until they deliver the baby. Talk to us a little bit about that, because for me, this is something that we cannot even imagine when you live in a big city, that these things happen across the country.
Yeah, so there were policies implemented that removed birth from communities. And those policies then resulted in evacuation and confinement policies. And I have been a parent and I have expected a baby, and evacuation and confinement are really ugly words that are associated with a really, exciting and beautiful and special time in your life. So people typically, for a healthy, normal pregnancy with, a regular amount of risk, will typically be evacuated around 37 weeks, which means that they are flown out of their community. Only in the last about 8 years, I think, have they been allowed an escort. So often they were flown out alone to go and wait in hostels to deliver their babies. So if you were flown out at 37 weeks and you don't deliver your baby until 41 and a half weeks, and then you're kept for, another 3 or 4 days in the hospital, you're probably still not getting back to your community for at least a 6-week trip total. So you're away from your support systems. In First Nations communities, birth is a ceremony and a celebration, and it was often attended by aunties and grandmothers and support people. And until I believe 2017, there were no escorts permitted, or at least not funded. So people were delivering alone and then caring for their babies alone, and then traveling back on those very tiny little airplanes alone to get their baby back home. So it's a system that is very isolating. It led to a number of, I'm sure, unintended outcomes. So breastfeeding rates in the First Nations communities are very, very low, because often breastfeeding takes a little bit more time to establish and requires a little more support, but they've already been away from home for 3 or 4 weeks at this point in time, and they just want to get back. They know if they introduce formula, their babies are less likely to lose weight, less likely to develop jaundice, and therefore they'll formula feed just to get home sooner. So, which has lifelong impacts really on health for those children. So.
Absolutely. So talk about breastfeeding. So there is now Indigenous Milk Medicine Week to really raise awareness of the importance of breastfeeding. Let's talk a little bit about that, because we will be back in August to discuss that topic specifically in depth for that particular week. But just give a little bit of a hint why that was created and where are we going with this?
So Indigenous Milk Medicine Week is very, very important. So we do recognize it actually originated in the United States, but in Canada, First Nations families are among the least likely populations to choose breastfeeding. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the reason to invest so much time and energy into supporting breastfeeding First Nations families, I think, is the payoff is so great. One, they're a younger population than the rest of the population, which means they're much more likely to be in the childbearing years. They typically have more children on average than the rest of the population. And so they're, we talked about the number of reasons that they are at risk for other health conditions that are protected or that breastfeeding is protective against. But also Indigenous Milk Medicine Week is intended to recognize that breastfeeding goes beyond food. Mm-hmm. And there is healing and reconciliation that happens with breastfeeding. It's an opportunity to break cycles and to build connection with babies, where there was a time where children were ripped away from their families and sent to residential schools and boarding homes and through the 60s scoop into child welfare. And so a lot of those traditions, those cultural traditions, those connections, that attachment was lost. And this is a way that we can invest in families to help bring that back together again.
This is amazing. And so back to the pregnancy. So the high-risk pregnancies, what I learned is from SoLookout, they either get to Winnipeg, which is 3.5 hours away by car, or Thunder Bay, that was almost 5 hours on my way back from SoLookout. So they can access one of those two NICUs, or if it's extreme case, they can come to Sunnybrook in Toronto, other big hospitals. And I put myself in those parents' shoes, going away from my comfort zone, my community, the people who know me, to be alone in a big city and scared. You're already scared, you're pregnant, and you don't know what's going to happen. It's a high-risk pregnancy. So there is all those components. And then we always talk about culturally safe care, particularly to those families who are going to come to these big cities and stay in those big hospitals for months at a time by themselves, as you know, maybe one escort, but far away from their support system. Mm-hmm. What does it look like, this cultural safe care in practice? And why is this critical to improving the health outcomes of the families?
So I think one of the big questions that we need to consider when we're talking about culturally safe care is looking at families and asking the question, like, what are the issues? Not treating them as an issue. And so, people first care, people-centered care. And I think that's a really big component of it to start with. And also, I think the admitting that, I'm not familiar with your traditions and practices. Can you tell me more about them? And being truly open to that, I think, is really important. And I really want to thank you again for demonstrating that, is, being really open to asking questions and coming to visit us in SoLookout so that you can really see firsthand sort of the conditions that are experienced by a lot of families in this area. So I think I was telling you earlier today that I did a land acknowledgement for the Breastfeeding Committee for Canada yesterday. And I really like to sort of put a call to action into a land acknowledgement so that it helps people reflect on their own practice. And so some of the questions that I asked yesterday as we work within health spaces, we must ask ourselves, how are we actively listening to Indigenous voices, experiences, and healing practices? In what ways are we dismantling the systemic barriers that Indigenous families face in accessing culturally safe care? And how are we committing to ongoing learning, humility, and accountability in partnership with Indigenous communities? So I think participating here today is a demonstration of that the wanting, knowing that we're not doing as well as we could be, and how can we do better? So learning and being open to that, and, maybe even reflecting on our own practices and finding ways that we could have done better and learning from that.
Wow, this is incredible. My question is this the way that institutions can continue their everyday practice, but towards a true reconciliation? Because we talked before, yes, I do the land acknowledgement, but what does that really mean? You just don't want to do for the sake of doing because you feel that you have an obligation to do now that we know. But to be meaningful, to really incorporate on your everyday practice, in your everyday work, in your everyday group of people that you work with, and just not being the words there.
Yes, and that's exactly is, often, and that's progress. Even land acknowledgements being played at baseball games and before conferences, that's progress. At least there is a recognition of these historical traumas that have been inflicted upon Indigenous communities. But what's the next step then? Is to challenge the change. And how do we do better? And make it meaningful, less superficial, and more, asking ourselves, what do we do next?
And you talk about having allies because you're not in every table. So how can we, a non-Indigenous organization like ours, Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, where we try to bring Indigenous families here to guide our actions, our next steps. I went to your community to learn what can we do together, because it's not me doing for you, it's us co-creating something together that is meaningful to your communities. How can we do this better? How can we sit down, have a discussion, and what is the next steps? I feel that a lot of tables that I go around and board meetings and committee meetings, that I bring a parent perspective as a Preemie parent. Everybody wants to learn, but there seems to have some obstacle that it puts you in front and do something about it. It feels like there is a barrier in between. Mm-hmm. And I can't really understand, why can't we communicate better? Why can't we do something better?
So I think that's a really, really important question. And I think that one of the things that we can do is recognize, am I in a space right now that there is no Indigenous representation? How can we ask if that, the inclusivity of a First Nations family, so that perspective is being able to be shared. Sometimes, though, we do act as a conduit for bringing those voices forward. So I don't ever claim to speak on behalf of the First Nations families. I try to amplify the stories and the voices that I've heard. I would say it's 100% better if you can have a First Nations family do that firsthand. But when that's not possible, what are we doing to amplifying those stories, to hearing those voices and making sure that that perspective is considered at every table?
Absolutely. So when you look at all the barriers that you presented, there are many, many, many barriers. Some probably are simpler than others to solve, to address. When you think about the pregnant people and these mothers and parents coming back into communities to raise those babies, is particularly, obviously, our preterm babies were so fragile. They're so vulnerable to men. When you talk to me about the overcrowded houses and the parents take turns to sleep so everybody can sleep in the house because there's no room for everybody to lie down at the same time. And we talked when I was there about safe sleep, the safe sleep standards that we have here. The big hospitals say, oh, you have to have a crib, nothing in the crib. There is not even a room for a crib. So things that we cannot imagine that they're happening in Canada, right? Because for me, coming from a country that is Brazil, that we have so many socioeconomic problems, I never thought that Canada had those similar problems or even worse problems because they're so remote. When you look at all these barriers, what are the most urgent needed to be addressed to eliminate the systemic inequities? Can we tackle them all at once? So there's some that should be tackled first. So you get these children who is the future of our country in a better health situation, or set them for a successful path.
I think the issue is that everything is so interconnected. It's where do you begin? So, if you've ever heard the little analogy about the hummingbird trying to put out the wildfire, and that we're all just trying to do what we can with what we have, but the collective voices coming together, working together, having these conversations and asking these questions. I did see a comment in the chat about understanding each other's cultures may presumably help reduce those barriers. And absolutely, that is what I invite you all to do. I mean, I am not an expert on Indigenous culture. I know the practices and traditions that I grew up with in the area I grew up with. I encourage you to, if you're invited to a First Nations community, if you have opportunity to visit a cultural presentation of sorts or interact in some way, please, absolutely take advantage of those opportunities and be a willing learner. And it might not be the way that you're used to learning is peppering people with questions or that kind of thing. It might just be sitting and listening to an elder tell stories and having tea with them, observing how other people treat the elder, for example. That's something that always stands out to me is who is attentive to the elder, who is the one bringing them a cup of tea, who is them asking them what they need. So if you have opportunities to engage with Indigenous communities, especially if it's an invitation, people are very open to that. They're open to helping people learn.
Absolutely. And I fully experienced that. And it was such a rich experience for me to learn, to just be there, coming with no agenda, just sit there with all those mothers in that community that Karen drove. And we were just sitting for the afternoon, sharing our stories of birth, of babies, of losses, of preterm birth. And it was so rich what I learned. And so now coming back, I want to share with my team what I learned. Mm-hmm. And maybe we don't know what is our next step, but I think the learning is so important, right? To understand from one another. And we know we have work to do. And I agree with you. We have to amplify people's voices when they are not at the table. And I think that is an obligation that we have as an organization to why we don't have the people sitting with us. Mm-hmm. What can we teach others what we learned?
Yes.
And I think that is our goal right now as an organization. But I want to hear from you, what is your hope for the future of all the First Nation children's health?
Well, my hope, my vision, my dream is it's equity. I don't think First Nations communities are asking for more. They're asking for the same. So how do we ensure that they have the same access to services and supports as non-Indigenous children? It's not specific to First Nations families, but there's a video called the Postal Code Lottery. And it just talks about sort of the environment in which you grow up in sets you on a path to health and wellness for the rest of your life. If you're in a community that is safe, you have places to play, outdoor spaces, access to healthy foods, enough, a safe roof over your head, quality education, literacy programs and things like that. Just your ability to be a healthy adult, to have a good job, to achieve higher levels of education and so on. It's astronomical. So when you look at all of the barriers that First Nations children are facing, and yet some still come out on the other end, what I would like to see also is more examination into the resilience of those children. Mm. So they have been given really the short end of the stick, and yet we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have, people that are advocates like Shannon Kustashian, who was 15 years old, standing up in Parliament saying, this is not right. Our children deserve better. So if we still are getting those kind of outcomes, what sort of protective factors are there, and how do we build them into more families and more communities?
Absolutely. Wow, Candi, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's such a pleasure to have you, to learn from you. Sometimes we don't even have the words to express because it is a lot to take in, and we have a lot of comments on the chat. Juliet is watching us live from the Netherlands, and she also mentioned the mental health here of the Indigenous people, that it was a very sad reality, and it is a very sad reality, and we do have work to do. And I think we have to continue to show people this is a real problem. We need to address those problems. So I'm so grateful that you took the time today to be here with us, and you'll be back in August to talk about the Indigenous Milk Medicine Week. And I'm so happy that we can actually talk about that and amplify those messages for the community at large, and teach all healthcare providers who are non-Indigenous, working in hospitals in Canada, serving those communities, what is important, why do they need to learn, why this matters to families and to the communities on the long term, because this is not a short term, is a long term. It is looking at the life cycle of the children, creating a better future for all these children. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn, and for you to be here today. I couldn't thank you enough, you and your amazing team. And I'm going to share your link here if people want to get in touch with you and the work that you do in Sioux Lookout with 33 different communities. They can contact Slifna on this link here on the website.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you, Candi. I see you shortly.
Okay, thank you.
And to all of you watching us live today, thank you for joining this episode of the Preemie Chats. And if you missed part of today's session or want to revisit it, you can find this episode and all past episodes of the Preemie Chats on our YouTube channel or on our website, which is right here, the CanadianPreemies.org. While you're there, you can explore many resources and support options we offer to help families on their journey. And I also want to remind you that on November 6th, we have our very first gala in Toronto, and all the information is also on our website. And we are hoping many of you can join us live to celebrate the life and the resilience of our premature babies and their families. And as a charitable organization, CPBF relies on the generous support of people like you. Your donations allow us to continue empowering families of premature babies every step of the way. Together, we can create a brighter future for all preemies and their families. So thank you for being part of this community. And we'll see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay well.